Some of this is controversial and is intended to bring you to question as well as shift some of the things we've been taught. The following is something people may think sounds Native American or even pagan. But ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee, or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee. Although that may sound Native American, and maybe even pagan, it's actually from right out of the Bible. Job chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. Who knoweth not in all these that the hand of the Lord hath wrought this? In whose hand is the soul of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind? And a newer version. But ask now the animals, and they will teach you, and the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you. And let the fish of the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the soul of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind. Amazingly, there are way more dots to connect between Native American and the Bible than what many people have been taught to think by the public schools establishment. Likewise, much of what we've been taught about paganism has been a lie, according to the movie The Da Vinci Code, as well as its sequel, Angels and Demons. You know, everything has intelligence within it, and it's amazing what messages you get from different things. Consider the beauty of flowers, for instance. What beauty flowers possess. And what about Moses and the burning bush? That's right, even Moses was listening and receiving from a bush. Bush communion. The original Bushman. Tree talker may end up being called tree whisperer, and even better, tree listener. Maybe he was a good rock whisperer and listener too. Maybe that's why he was able to strike a rock and have water pour out. The original rock star. Is this fun or what? Now, from the moon's perspective. It's amazing when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, what he said. The message he got from the moon's perspective is, the earth is a vessel floating in a sea of space. That perspective put everybody under Admiralty law. All the lights turned on in the attorneys' minds that we are all vessels floating in a sea of space. This is an interesting perspective. If we are all vessels, and if we're all under Admiralty law, and you're the one that's in control of your vessel, you're the captain on the high seas. Have you ever heard, teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves? Nature's evidence points to the fact that we are all meant to be self-governed as much as possible. Let's show you how. Admiralty law, or maritime law, is the distinct body of law that governs the maritime questions and offenses. It is a body of both domestic law governing maritime activities and private international law governing the relationships between private entities that operate vessels on the oceans. And if someone breaks our rules of peace bad enough, we can make them walk the plank, or whatever appropriate corrective action we choose. It's up to us. We make the law, and we will. There are only two types of intelligence, as I said, freedom versus slavery, faith versus fear. This is essential for understanding politics. Socialism and democracy, Democrat or Republican, liberal versus conservative, are easily distorted and are obviously misunderstood without the proper understanding of the laws of empowerment. None dare call it conspiracy. Abbreviated NDCC is a book by Gary Allen with Larry Abraham, which talks a lot about the conspiracy of socialism slowly taking over the United States. And I just wish the author of that book better understood the laws of empowerment, but I can say the same for a lot of books. The introduction is by Congressman John G. Schmitz, and it includes several endorsements from prominent leaders such as Clarence E. Mansion, former Dean, Notre Dame Law School; Norman Dodd, Chief Investigator of Reese Committee to Investigate Foundations; Dan Smoot, former assistant to President J. Edgar Hoover, who was the first director of the FBI; and Ezra Taft Benson, former Secretary of Agriculture, as well as a couple of other important icons. Dr. Barney Finkel, president of the Jewish Right, said, "Since people of the Jewish faith have been the #1 historical victims of the communist conspiracy, we wish every member of our faith would carefully read this book so they will become aware of the forces which often attempt to manipulate them." Well, the Rothschild family proclaims to be Jewish, yet they even funded the Holocaust, which devastated the Jewish community. And one more NDCC endorsement from Dr. Medford Evans, former Chief of Security for the Atom Bomb Project, or Manhattan Project, said, "This book concerns the way in which our nation and other nations are actually governed. As Benjamin Disraeli said, this is not the way in which most people think nations are governed. The whole subject of the insiders who so largely control our political and economic lives is a fascinating mystery. For the reader who is intelligent but uninitiated in the literature of superpolitics, I can think of no better introduction to the field than NDCC." Again, that was the former Chief of Security for the atomic bomb. The history of the atomic bomb shows us another clear example of the psychology behind what's been happening. Of over 130,000 people who were under the Manhattan Project, who invented the atomic bomb, it's estimated that only a few dozen people in the entire country even knew that the name Manhattan Project was a secret code name for the project with the goal of creating the atomic bomb. Only about 1,000 were even aware that work on atoms was involved. So about 130,000 had no idea what their work was about. How could they gather scientists together under the Manhattan Project and give them assignments in the building of the atomic bomb without the scientists knowing what it was about? How could that be? Where only a few dozen out of 130,000 of them knew what it was about. Why? Because the few dozen who knew and controlled the project at the top level divided the project up into little pieces so small no one else could put two and two together to figure out what it was. When everyone had collectively all completed their assignments, all that information was brought together, and the few at the top had integrated the atomic bomb. This is the same disintegrated way the public school system works. Everything has been broken up, divided into small pieces to keep people looking down, so they don't look up to see the big picture. Even with scientists, and I have a lot more respect for the kind of doctor that works in the lab than I do for those who practice medicine, because instead of studying anymore or doing research which would require them to remember or expand on what they learned, they start taking the advice of drug reps. And it's tough to remember 10, 20, 30 years down the road when they're not using the information anymore, whatever they learned the 7 to 10 years they were going to school. But I have a lot more respect for the medical research scientists who work in the lab, and even they're specialized in such a focused specialty, and they don't study much else. They typically just focus on their area of specialty. But what if they studied it all? What do you think about that concept? Let's integrate everything and do it all. With computer technology helping to connect the dots, it's become much easier, and I think we're coming back around to that idea. And hopefully, you're seeing more clearly that everything is interconnected. The public school system. My father challenged its integrity for decades. Why do they wait until the last day of school to pass or fail you? Why wait until the very last day for the final exam? My father learned that one of the fastest, easiest, and most powerful learning methods in the world is to simply give everyone the final exam on the first day of school as an open book exam, where each question gives the page numbers in the book where to find the answers. Everyone can simply look up the answers and write them down, and everybody makes an A. This method of learning has been a proven method of learning for decades as one of the most powerful ways in the world to learn. So why wait until the last day to give what they call a final exam? Because the public school system is set up to simply pass or fail you, as if their main goal is to pass or fail you, above actually teaching you. We've been giving our final exams on the first day of school for about 40 years now, and every single person who has completed it has made an A, and they actually learn the material just as good, if not better, looking up the answers and writing them down. My father had his master's in public school administration, had an opportunity to become principal and superintendent, paid vacations every summer, and he gave it all up. He gave it all up after he discovered many of the weaknesses of the public school system. He knew someone had to get the true and correct information out to people. From the start, since he knew God was giving him the answers to life and death, he never charged admission. He just prayed for God's help to sustain him. He took a big leap of faith and was sustained by one miracle after another after another. When my father was brought in by the top medical lymphologists in the world, when they saw him, they accepted him as the first non-medical doctor in the world to become a member of their organization. When they saw the way he was talking and what he had discovered, they said, "We've been so busy looking down, studying the little details, we never bothered to look up to see the big picture." How we do one thing is how we do most things. There's a lot of truth to that. The public schools and other systems are no exception to this rule. By eliminating key areas of information from the public schools, the entire system has been infected. Seth Riggs is considered the greatest vocal coach in our modern time. He was the vocal coach for Michael Jackson and has coached Stevie Wonder, Barbra Streisand, and Ray Charles. The first top university he did vocal training with ruined his voice. The second top university ruined his voice further. And the third top university ruined his voice even further. His personal journey, as he tells it, led him through a rather rough public school experience in the development of his own voice. Just as none of the papers hanging on the walls of doctors' offices actually perform any healing miracles for us, Seth's master's degrees did not help his voice recover at all from training his voice wrong. Through all that, he never lost his passionate desire to sing beautifully. He kept going to the cathedral and taking his petition to God to help in finding his voice. And one day, the miracle came. Seth was inspired with the knowledge and gift of voice. As I sat through a session he did with a group of several students in his Hollywood home, he demonstrated his coaching ability with one student after another, all with miraculous results. When he first listened to the student sing, he would instantly know what was wrong and what the remedy was. He demonstrated perfect knowledge in describing the anatomy and physiology of what the problem and solution was with each student in a way that was so advanced that it would also go right over the heads of just about everyone listening. But I know he was making it just as simple as he could make it for us. Then he would ask the student to sing in a specific way, and as soon as they were done, the miracle was done. That particular problem of their voice was solved. Vocal coach Deborah Bonner was partnered with Seth Riggs for 15 years and still takes her groups to him. I thought she was the most intuitive and best vocal coach I'd ever seen until she introduced us to Seth and gave him the honor and recognition he deserved. And of course, both Deborah and Seth give the greatest honor to God. That greatness rubs off. It rubs off from great people. Deborah is an amazing example of integrity and the level of empowerment that happens while giving credit where credit is due. And she may be even better than Seth in some of her own special intuitive ways, although she is very humble about it. Watching such rare mastery with vocal coaching instantly reminded me of the similarities of how my father and I have worked with people's health issues. Much of the science may go right over the beginners' heads, but when we show them the simple and easy solutions, miracles just happen. The definition of disintegration: the process of losing cohesion or strength. The twin problems of economic failure and social disintegration. The process of coming to pieces. The disintegration of infected cells. Physics: a process which a nucleus or other subatomic particle emits a smaller particle or divides into smaller particles. What happens to oxygen when it turns on the life process of the cells? You get superoxide. That's an oxygen molecule missing an electron. It damages the cells so many times per second, it can rip cancer cells to pieces in seconds, so small you can't even see the cancer cell under a microscope anymore. That's what's physically doing that. Now we know. It's good to have something within ourselves that can actually integrate the superoxide again back to the whole oxygen molecule. Otherwise, the superoxide will continue to disintegrate even the healthy cells in the surrounding area. Superoxide dismutase is an enzyme that reintegrates the superoxide molecules back to oxygen molecules with 1 million of those superoxide molecules per second, every second. This is at the fundamental core of the laws of empowerment or disempowerment, life and death. To help you see integration versus disintegration, the definition of integrity, which is the root of integration. Isn't that interesting? We'll expand a lot on this. Integrity is one of the most important and oft cited of virtue terms. it is also perhaps the most puzzling. It's misunderstood. For example, while it is sometimes used virtually synonymously with moral, we also at times distinguish acting morally from acting with integrity. Persons of integrity may in fact act immorally, though they would usually not know they're acting immorally. They don't know. Remember that. Thus, one may acknowledge a person to have integrity, even though that person may hold what one thinks are importantly mistaken moral views. Remember, they don't know. And by the time we're finished with the laws of empowerment, you'll know this is false, because you'll see that moral behavior and integrity are actually inseparable. But even those who've written this definition hadn't integrated the two. Why? Well, it just shows how new and important the Laws of Empowerment program is. They didn't have the option of learning from this program. But this is a major fundamental shift in our integrity. As self-integration, on the self-integration view of integrity, integrity is a matter of persons integrating various parts of their personality into a harmonious, intact whole. Understood in this way, the integrity of persons is analogous to the integrity of things. Integrity is primarily a matter of keeping the self intact and uncorrupted. The self-integration view of integrity makes integrity a formal relation to the self. DID is dissociative identity disorder, which was formerly called multiple personality disorder. Now we know the brain has just been literally fragmenting, partitioning, and disintegrating. This is what we've been talking about. Integrity, and how it's associated with disintegration versus integration. Another interesting fact is the therapy used for those with DID is called integrative therapy. This is how I think about everything. The laws of empowerment give us new corrective lenses to view the world. Christ understood DID. On the cross, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." How did he understand this principle of integration or disintegration? Basic laws of personal development, that's how he understood it. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 23. Every knee shall bow, and every tongue confess. I believe this is the only way any of us will survive the shift that's now happening. People have two options when they're faced with their issues. Number one, change their behavior, which means bending the knee. Or number two, forget it. This is at the core of the laws of empowerment. If you want to increase your intelligence and integrate your personality into a whole, into a fully integrated personality, you have to actually be in integrity with the truth. It's too much dissonance knowing and not acting accordingly, also known as cognitive dissonance. The mental anguish experienced by experiencing two conflicting beliefs in the same situation at the same time. This dissonance creates such terror, our brain usually discards one of the two beliefs. Whichever one is not in harmony with what we choose as our future behavior. It's why we forget if we don't choose to be in harmony with the truth. It's harmony versus dissonance. This is at the core of the laws of empowerment. Many of the facets of truth start disappearing right away as soon as people fall out of integrity, until the whole thing's gone eventually for those who continue down that path. That's right. People change their belief system based on their behavior, the choices they make, more than anything else. But this is what happens. In order to even retain many of the key facets of the truth, we have to be in harmony with the laws. This is just the way we develop. We've been teaching some of these principles as the basic cycle of personal development and the circle of truth in the Why It's Possible video series of the online Applied Lymphology course. Hosea chapter 4 verse 6. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me. Seeing that thou hast forgotten the law of thy God, I will also forget thy children. You are learning why. Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. Do you know what happened with the Tower of Babel? The confounding of tongues. Well, the attitude the people had was a social disorder. What was the principle, law, or process they were out of alignment with? Even Ivy League schools have been teaching the social disorder of business is just business. If someone gets in your way, you just run right over the top of them and keep on going. It's just business. This is a social disorder, similar to the disorder they had with the Tower of Babel. And it's similar to attitudes too many businesses have today. Take the health business. It has become the biggest industry out there, with more money being made in health every year. People dying faster and faster, but this is part of the problem with it. They think, let's get some of that money. Let's take a niche, take some of the top products, copy some of their prime ingredients, slap our own label on a product, and get it out in the market right away. They don't care about who actually wrote the book on that science. They're not given any credit. It's the attitude of, how can I do this without you? There's no integrity at all. There's no honor, no loyalty, any of those virtues. It's just absolutely not there. It's a social disorder, the whole attitude and thought process of, how can I do this without you? Like they don't even care. People with that attitude, some call them copycats. They might call it modeling. But I've got to tell you, they don't typically retain even half of what they could have learned. And I have a lot of compassion for these people. We know several seemingly successful people who've had that attitude and have not retained even half of what they could have. We hope we can help them see it was never necessary to have that attitude. No amount of financial success can compensate for the disintegration of our personality. So it isn't the intelligent choice. And we can help a lot more people if we act more as a team. At least give credit where credit is due. Every time we've seen people who didn't give credit where credit was due, they started missing information. My father did his best, but there was at least one important instance where he didn't go back and say thank you to someone he knew deserved some credit. One individual was his physics teacher, who he described as thinking he was crazy because all he did was teach him how to write and break down equations. And he knew there was more to physics than writing and breaking down equations. But some years later, when he'd gathered enough discoveries on the life and death processes of the cells, it just hit him as clear as can be. You can write the formulas for life and death, do it. and he put pen to paper, and out came the basic formula for life and the basic formula for death, which have always been totally accepted by the top medical minds who have had the opportunity to be shown them, even though they've never been taught in any medical school. A common challenge for authors and public speakers who develop training programs is that over time, it tends to become more and more about themselves. And although my father never went back to say thank you to his physics teacher, he always made sure he made this full story available as a way of giving due credit to his physics teacher. And he did the same with everything else he picked up over the years. Credit for who discovered what and where he learned things from as much as possible, which only added credibility to his entire program and helped him gather and retain as much as he could from all of those sources, instead of only getting half of it and not even the most important half, which is what usually happens if we don't give due credit in one form or another. You see, inside of all of us, deep down, we know if we're giving due credit or not. When we're not, we're cutting ourselves off to one degree or another. There are some important insights for you to understand here. Some very good reasons for me to talk about this. For example, what if that physics teacher had a greater blessing to share with him once he'd come back to report his success and appreciation? Sometimes all it takes is one wrong move with our relationships, and that physics teacher could have had connections my father had no idea about. Maybe the bigger blessing would have come from someone else that physics teacher knew who could have helped put those formulas on the map for everyone in the scientific world to see. Do you see where I'm going with this? Maybe my father never really had to struggle the way he did. Well, I'm not saying I know that for sure, but you never know what you don't know. I do know that people like to feel appreciated and to see good fruits of their labors. People like to see how they've blessed the lives of others. We're all meant to play the role of teacher and student in different ways with our relationships, depending on where our strengths and weaknesses are. Regardless of race or religion, if you put the laws of empowerment into action, you get the results. Anthony Robbins said, "If you want to be successful, find someone who has achieved the results you want and copy what they do, and you'll achieve the same results." This is a law. And when you've been rather blessed and empowered by anyone who's played the role of a teacher in your life, at least have the honor to give them due credit and to obtain as much of their blessing as possible. Otherwise, you may never know what greater blessings you missed out on. This also affects our reputation. You can be the best copycat in the world, and you may just end up with a reputation for being a big copycat. And be very careful about who you model after. Take a very close look at their finer personality traits because, although it may seem subtle, one of the main ways we learn to duplicate is by simply watching. And although they may seem like the life of the party, I advise you to double check their fruits to make sure they're not leaving a bloody trail everywhere they go, like a social sociopath. When it comes down to the choice between greed or the love of money versus the true purpose of money and enlightened wealth, it takes an empowered person to stay integrated with the tree of life aspect of wealth, what is called enlightened wealth. Giving credit where credit is due also shows grace, as it does when you spotlight or highlight the greatness of other people in your presentation. That shows grace. Interviewing other people, showing their greatness, shows grace and helps us stay balanced with our own ego. We like to showcase our greatest success stories, and some of the more successful people are not so easy to get a hold of. I confess to have emailed Tony Robbins several times over the past couple decades without any response from him until more recently. When I had asked if he would share his story as part of a rather humble ongoing docuseries available on YouTube called The Secrets of Your Internal Fountain of Youth, the response I got back from an assistant was simply that he would not be participating. Well, I actually consider the response from an assistant great progress after having no response for so long. And I may have made some mistakes years back in how I framed the words in my emails. Perhaps I was a bit too pushy or something, I don't remember. But at least I was swinging for the fence. It's true that my father helped him get started on his path in 1978 when he was 18. And about a year ago, I was introduced to Jim Britt and talked to Jim Britt over the phone, who evidently also deserves due credit for helping Tony around that same exact time. And I've always wanted to get Tony's version of the story. Well, about 10 years ago, John Gasparo came to one of my events at a bookstore in West Hollywood called the Bodhi Tree. John Gasparo was good friends with Tony at the time he was 18, which is when he describes his life at that time as living in a cubicle. John walked into Tony's humble living space, looked at him, and said, "Tony, if I had your looks with my brains, I could accomplish anything." And Tony said, "What?" And John said, "I told you, Tony, if I had your looks with my brains, I could accomplish anything." And John got Tony thinking that if he had some brains, he could accomplish anything. This sounds so funny, and I wish Tony could be right here to give his side of it. John then introduced Tony to my father and his work, and Tony was calling my father pretty regular for about a couple months straight. John said the next time he saw Tony, he was selling his first audio series on TV. My father liked to talk, and he was known for consulting people for free on the phone his entire life. And he consulted Tony for free, giving him all the answers he could right over the phone. When John first told me this story 10 years ago in West Hollywood, he brought his copy of my dad's book along with him, and he opened it up and showed me how he had it all marked up with notes he'd made from reading it from cover to cover about a dozen times. I've since talked to John Gasparo, who says Tony's never been back to say thank you to him either since that time, nor has he responded to any of his messages. Although he's never been back to say thank you, I do understand that he did make mention of my father in a very early writing he did. Tony receives many offers for many big projects. I know he turns down offers to participate in much bigger projects than the ones I've invited him to consider. He was offered an interview in the new Go Rebound film, which he declined, even though rebounding has been a huge part of his success and has helped him get focus ever since my father introduced him to it in 1978. I've personally interviewed several key people in rebounding history as part of The Secrets of Your Internal Fountain of Youth, and I'm very excited I was able to participate in the new Go Rebound film, even though I haven't seen the finished product yet, because it hasn't even been released yet. But with Tony's busy schedule, he can't accept every offer that comes his way. He has an extremely busy schedule, and has a lot to prioritize. Some of the most successful people I know are burning the candle at both ends, and sometimes they lose sight of other things they don't think are as important. It's happened to me before while working on huge projects like this one. And we aren't perfect, but we are passionate about helping people. As this program achieves amazing success, perhaps Tony will come back around full circle. We can always hope for that. Here's a meme from an amazing and beautiful man, Steve Jennings. I'm not in a popularity contest. I'm here to help and get important points across. Yeah, I've got a lot of haters, but haters can be awesome assets. Actually, I love haters. And a quote from his May 5th Facebook post that goes along with this. It seems recently that a few of my consulting clients who work with me that have grown, improved, and prospered in their businesses and their lives have experienced several people becoming jealous, hateful, and downright mean. If this is something you've experienced, then you very well understand. And if you're someone who is still striving and beginning to gain recognition for your efforts, I'd recommend you get ready for the haters and know they're coming, because they usually appear as your life begins to rise. Yes, many will support you and be happy for you. However, some will surely not. No need to be in a popularity contest, as even the most wonderful people have haters. Yes, it's the same old thing. You begin to build a better life and help others, and then the haters and the naysayers show up to hold you down. They'll do anything to find fault and actively spread lies and negativity. Yes, the haters are hurting, unhappy, and dissatisfied with their lives, and they hate that you're working and striving to achieve and better your life. They're weak people filled with fear and mostly upset with themselves, so they delight in tearing you down and are jealous that you're aspiring to rise your life up. The haters spread rumors, falsehoods, and talk behind your back. Note, a strong, self-reliant, and confident individual would never do this. So, stand up for yourself in the most dignified manner possible as needed and forge forward and love the haters because they actually help you and because love always wins. These statements from Steve Jennings fit perfectly right here in the laws of empowerment. And Steve Jennings is another gentleman with an amazing story. My father taught, "No RCC FFCB. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me." No RCC FFCB stands for no ridicule, criticize, condemn, find fault, or cast blame, which are all from hate. My father was a shining example of how he never let anyone else's success get to him, even if they were too busy to come back and say thank you. It may not be easy to understand God's plan in the big scheme of things, God's timeline. While many students of my father became very successful and even famous, such as Tony Robbins and Wayne Dyer, my father never let it get between his friendship with anyone when they got even more attention and they weren't talking about him. And how many of their students have also moved on to make their own programs? In the rebounding arena alone, we have Al Carter and Tony Robbins, who learned its health benefits directly from my father, and from Al Carter alone, he taught Dave Hall, who decided to use the slogan, "Don't just exercise cellar size," which wasn't very creative since my father was using "Don't just exercise lymphocyze." And Dave Hall taught J.B. Burns, who came up with the name urban rebounding. Looking back and watching the way each of these lineages developed, where they originated from, and how they broke off has been very insightful for me, because the same principles have been at play from the beginning of time. The same thing has happened with every art in history, from fighting arts to healing arts, and I feel eternally grateful for having my father as a teacher. I feel honored that my father was part of influencing so many people, not only directly himself, but also through the efforts of his students and students of students, and so on. He is one of the greatest grand masters. He was a real chief, and from a whole family of chiefs. He didn't like being tied down to contracts even after he'd signed them. He'd been hurt by several business deals, and I personally think he just didn't have the businessman personality for certain business relationships. He was never focused on the money, but focused on helping people, and not many people could work in a business relationship with him because of that. In fact, he happily turned down several big business deals when they refused not to turn anyone away. He did make a great chief, though, and created an amazing legacy. And it's awesome to see the legacy some of his students and students of students have created and are now creating. A good teacher will take honor in empowering their students and watching them reach levels beyond what they have achieved themselves. And a good student will honor a teacher who empowers them so. Don't get me wrong. We have been very human and have suffered great persecution. When things were rough, my father liked to say, "Whatever you persist in doing becomes easier." Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "That which we persist in doing becomes easier for us to do. Not that the nature of the thing itself has changed, but that our power to do so is increased." And a quote from my father, which sort of sounds like it's from out of the Bible, although I can't find it anywhere. If through our suffering we learn from it, at least it's not in vain. My father said this a lot, so I finally asked myself, if we're not ready to learn, what must we be ready to do? The answer? Suffer. And no one is meant to suffer. We are all meant to learn one way or another. An old blast from my past named Greg Argyle shared a quote from his father. "Life is not fair. Most of the time, you have to roll with the punches." That's bittersweet truth. When I was very young, I knew it wasn't fair that my father was so persecuted and never got the credit he deserved. With all the opposition he encountered, and my whole family all suffered with him as a family, especially those of us who were younger, who were not off and married already. Being human, it wasn't always easy to see people become more successful on the business end, who were better when it came to business and marketing, who didn't have the same opposition my father had, and he still never let it get between his friendship with them. He was an awesome example of a loving teacher and always chose to take honor in the success of his students. We all must choose between love and hate. My father was a bit ahead of his time, actually. In many ways, the success of every empowerment leader has just continued to help lay the stepping stones. Each generation helps pave the way for others to move further and faster. When the student is ready, teachers have always appeared to help people at the level they've been ready to develop. Interesting enough, it's not always the sharpest tool in the shed or the sharpest person that is chosen to lead people, but the person the people are ready to learn from. Sometimes the sharpest tools in the shed are saved for later, especially when the masses haven't really been ready. We've had a lot of intuitive messages over the years. The message has come through as clear as can be that the greater purposes of my Father's work would someday be fulfilled in God's due time according to His master plan. It's tough to understand how so much truth could be held back. But if you're willing to keep asking the right questions, you'll keep getting answers. What happened with the Tower of Babel? They got the attitude, how can we even do this without our Creator, without God? And that, how our programming works, anything we do negatively with the Creator, because it's the Creator, is very destructive to try to negate the Creator in our programming. Very destructive. I know Dr. Mitchell Gibson is supportive of that. At one point, he was chief resident at Albert Einstein Medical Center as a psychologist. And then he had some pretty amazing spiritual experiences and discovered his gifts. He is a special master, and I found some of his work very harmonious and supportive. Thank you, Dr. Gibson. So with the confounding of tongues, the people could not even understand each other because they were so disintegrated, right? There is much evidence of at least one group who prayed with great faith in God and who were spared this disintegration. Now do you understand why truth comes as a sword? This is the role cognitive dissonance plays in creating the void that separates people from the tree of life. Matthew chapter 10, verse 34. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. If you understand the role of cognitive dissonance, you understand the sword that separates the wheat from the tares. If you can understand how truth comes as a sword, then it begins to make more sense why some truths have been held back, because people haven't been ready. And even after all this time, it appears most people still aren't very well prepared. Destroyers may be unleashed, but if you're in alignment with the laws, you have nothing to fear. If you're prepared, it's only going to accelerate your ascension. They carry a sword of truth, and the truth comes as a sword. Why? Because, as explained, when we are faced with the truth, we have two options. It's do or die at one level or another. So the bitter truth the destroyers share actually acts as an internal catalyst to empower those of us who are ready to make the positive shifts to obtain more of the sweet gold nuggets of empowerment, each of which are more of the fruit of the tree of life. Destroyers only act as destroyers for those who are not prepared or are unwilling to comply. Like God, nature is no respecter of persons. Before you know the truth, well, it's like before you know how to help somebody. Life is pretty simple. All you've got to do is feel sorry for them. But once you know what's causing them to die, what's causing their destruction, and you don't do something, then what? Once you understand these principles, and you know how many people need them, you're kind of morally responsible to pay it forward. Share it, basically. From Uncle Ben of Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. That's true. Where much is given, much is expected. We've all been given a constructive notice to comply and to help as many of our other Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Yogi, and Buddhist friends as possible do the same. Share the responsibilities so you don't feel like you're carrying a burden. Just watch what happens as you pass the laws of empowerment on to other people. One of the ways you can pay it forward is by showing us some love. If you've found value within this program, please send us some love.